Alright, so now that we know how to form perfect and pluperfect subjunctives, and once again, just review those charts a couple times, practice memorizing the different endings: perfect, active, irimeris, arid, irimeris, arint, pluperfect, active subjunctives, assem, assess, asset, assem, asset, assent, perfect passive subjunctives, fourth principal part plus sim, sis, sit, assint, and pluperfect passive subjunctives, fourth principal part plus assem, assess, asset, assem, asset, assent. So, speed review of all those forms. Once again, you'll just have to keep practicing them until you know them better. Now we have to talk about how to use them. So if we go review sequence of tenses and what we know so far, we'll remember that in the main clause, the main verb is either in the primary sequence, which is present, future, independent subjunctives, imperatives, anything that's happening now or will happen. Or you have a historic sequence, which we sometimes call a secondary sequence, which is any other past action. Now what we've learned so far is primary sequence takes present subjunctives and historic sequence takes imperfect subjunctives, but that's only because every use of the subjunctive which we've learned so far happens at the exact same time as the main verb. So purpose clauses, result clauses, fate clauses, indirect commands, all of those almost always occur at the same time as the main verb. Therefore, they use this chart. But there are other uses of the subjunctive which will try and give us actions that occur before the main verb. And so we have to expand our sequence of tenses chart and add prior time. And you'll notice under prior time over here, that's where we have our imperfect subjunctives and our pluperfect subjunctives. So, primary sequence, once again, that's present, future, future perfect, independent uses of the subjunctives, imperatives, all of those. At the same time, as we've already learned, it takes the present subjunctive, but if you want to talk about a prior time, it takes the perfect subjunctive. In historic or secondary sequence, if the action occurs at the same time in the subordinate clause, it takes the imperfect subjunctive, but if it occurs at a time prior to the main clause, it takes the pluperfect subjunctive. So, in order to use any of this chart or make sense of it at all, we have to learn what kinds of uses of the subjunctive might need a subordinate verb that talks about the prior time. And so, let's talk about cum clauses. So far we've learned that cum is a preposition, and it takes the ablative, and it's how you form the ablative of accompaniment. But cum is also a subordinating conjunction, which can mean several different things, but one of the most common is because or since. And when cum as a subordinating conjunction means because or since, we call this a cum clausal clause. Now, to explain why there's this confusion between cum as a preposition and cum as a subordinating conjunction, we have to understand that in older Latin, that is, Latin before 75 BC, and the classical Latin we generally talk about, the subordinating conjunction was quom, Q-U-O-M, versus cum as a preposition. But for some reason in classical Latin around the time of Cicero, they decided to shorten quom to cum, using the same spelling for both different words, which leads to the present confusion. So, anytime you spot cum, you have to decide, is this a preposition or is this a subordinating conjunction? Excuse me. So in order to do this, we need to pay attention to two things. First, cum is a preposition, takes an ablative. Is there an ablative right there that will help show you that it's serving as a preposition? And cum as a subordinating conjunction will need another verb. So is there an extra main verb floating around the sentence without any other conjunctions splitting it off from the rest of our main clause? If so, cum might actually be quom, the subordinating conjunction. Let's look at some examples and we can talk through how that actually works in that chart we've looked at. So in the first example, cum fortisit bene pugnat. So we have cum fortisit bene pugnat. Two separate clauses, two different main verbs. We have to figure out how they relate to one another. Anytime you see this, two separate clauses, two verbs, we have to find the main verb. Here it's bene pugnat, and we have to say, well, what tense is that? All right, pugno, pugnare, at endings. This is just third singular present active indicative. And then we have to say, okay, he fights well. That's our main clause. Now we have to come to that cum clause. Cum fortis sit. If we're in the present tense, that means we're in primary sequence. And then we have to say, okay, are we talking about same time or prior time? Same time will take the present subjunctive. Prior time would take the perfect subjunctive. Sit here is a present subjunctive, so we're in the same time. Once again, cum is going to be because or since. So since he is brave, he fights well. Sit is in the present subjunctive because it's primary sequence occurring at the same time as the main verb. Example number 2, cum fortis esset bene pugnavit. Now, basically the same sentence. The only thing we've changed are the tenses of our verbs. Instead of pugnat, third singular present active indicative, in sentence 2 we've changed it to pugnavit, third singular perfect active indicative, which means since we've moved to the secondary sequence, he fought well, we will also need to change the tense from sit, present subjunctive, to esset, imperfect subjunctive. So, esset is the imperfect subjunctive because it is in secondary sequence and it's occurring at the same time as the main verb. He fought well because he was brave. Same time. Sentence number 3. Cum me vocaverint veniam. So we'll stop. 2 clauses again. Our main clause, veniam, I will come, puts us in the present primary sequence. So we're in the primary sequence. We have to go into our cum clause now. We have vocaverint, and we have to say, okay, what tense is that? Arim, aris, arint, arit, arimus, aritis, arint. Added to the third principal part is going to be a perfect active subjunctive. So we have primary sequence. We have perfect active subjunctive, so we know it is prior time. So, I will come because they called me in the past. So, vocaverint, perfect active subjunctive in prior time because it's a primary sequence occurring before the main verb. And sentence number 4, cum me vocavisent veni. Right, splitting it off, 2 different clauses. We have vocavisent, we have veni. Veni just means I came, secondary sequence. This is a historic action. So then we have to go into our cum clause, and we see vocavisent. Think about this. We are now in historic sequence. So same time would be imperfect subjunctive. Prior time would be pluperfect subjunctive. Here we have the third principal part, vocavi plus essem, assess, asset. Essem, asset is assent. We have a pluperfect subjunctive. So vocavisent is pluperfect subjunctive because it's in secondary sequence indicating prior time. Because they had called me, I came. So, anytime you see this word cum, you got to pay attention. Once again, is cum serving as a preposition or a conjunction? Check. If it's functioning as a preposition, it will have an ablative nearby. There will not be adverbs or conjunctions splitting it apart from its adjective. A good general rule of thumb is that cum followed by a nominative or an accusative, probably a conjunction. If cum is serving like a conjunction, find the verb that ends the cum clause. And just like with relative clauses, cum will begin the clause, and the verb almost always marks the end of the clause. So it's a good general rule of thought for figuring out where your clauses start and stop. Always try and translate the main clause first, so you can figure out exactly how the cum clause is functioning. What sequence are we in? Do we need to talk about same time or prior time? And that's it. So, really quickly, 2 examples. Cum nox venerit statum domum iamus. So, once again, split it off. Cum nox venerit, there's our cum clause, starts with cum, ends with the verb. Statum domum eamus. So we have our main verb eamus, we have to figure out what this is. It's coming from ire. Ea helps remind us that it's a subjunctive. So we have an independent subjunctive here. This is hortatory, so let us go home immediately. Statum domum eamus. Cum, because night, and then we have to stop for a minute, is the same time or prior time. Eamus, independent usage of the subjunctive, shows us that we're in primary sequence. Primary sequence at the same time would take the present subjunctive. Prior time would take the perfect subjunctive. Venerit is a perfect subjunctive, so we're in prior time. Because night came, let us immediately go home. Number 2, almost the same sentence. Statum domum iuimus, cum nox venisset. So, immediately we went home, iuimus, right? First plural perfect active indicative of eo. So immediately we went home, cum nox venisset. Iuimus, secondary sequence. We have to look at venisset and say, okay, is this an imperfect subjunctive or a pluperfect subjunctive? We see the venisset ISSE showing us that perfect active infinitive, and we know that we're in the pluperfect subjunctive. So, prior time. Immediately we went home because night had come. And there's our 2 examples. So, work on translating exercise B. Pay very careful attention to the tensive mood of both the main and subordinate verbs, and pay attention to that chart for sequence of tenses. That's really the whole point of those activities, and good